They booked the cruise, printed matching shirts, and popped champagne on Instagram, but left my name off the guest list. No invite, no explanation, just silence. They thought I'd be too proud to ask why. What didn't they know I wasn't showing up as a passenger? That morning, as the Eleanor Blue prepared to sail, I stepped onto the deck, not with a suitcase, but with a signed maritime clearance and a pressed uniform. When the chief officer turned, saluted, and said, "Welcome aboard, Captain," I smiled for the first time in years. This isn't a revenge story. This is what happens when the outcast takes the helm. Stay with me. You won't believe what happened next. The first sound was the low hum of the refrigerator. The second, the steady thrum of rain tapping the kitchen skylight. The third woke her. It was 3:12 a.m. when Elena Harper stirred. She didn't need the clock to tell her. She'd woken at this exact hour too many times: deployment nights, emergency drills, those phantom waves of dread that sometimes still washed over her like ghost tides. But tonight, it wasn't her body waking her. It was a voice. She didn't move right away. Years in the Navy had trained her to stay still before reacting. She kept her breathing even, her eyes half-lidded, listening. It was Nate. Her husband's voice muffled cautious traveling in snippets through the hallway. "She won't see it coming." A pause. "Just get the paperwork ready." She blinked. Something in her chest folded in on itself, not quite pain, not yet. The phrase repeated in her mind like an echo on a sonar screen. She won't see it coming. For a few moments, she stayed there in bed, motionless, under the heavy quilt, pulse calm, like a diver beneath pressure. He was likely in the kitchen. The way the sound carried meant he had the balcony door cracked open. He always stepped outside for late-night calls. He thought it made him subtle. It made him predictable. She sat up slowly and pressed her feet to the cold wood floor. Her first instinct was denial. Maybe it was work. He was a contracts analyst for a private logistics firm. Paperwork was part of his daily vocabulary. But something about his tone, low measured, like someone orchestrating a withdrawal, a retreat. She walked down the hall barefoot, deliberately stepping where the floor didn't creak. As she passed his office, she noted the faint glow of the laptop screen still on. A spreadsheet is open. Red highlights. The balcony curtains swayed lightly in the salt breeze. She didn't open it. She just stood by the doorway, close enough to hear without being seen. "I've got it timed out," Nate was saying. "The forms go through Wednesday. She won't contest. She's not the confrontational type." Wednesday. Elena blinked again. That was her birthday. He was filing for divorce on her birthday. The breath that left her chest was silent but sharp, like a pressure valve releasing. Not from heartbreak, not yet. From clarity. From the sudden understanding that a war was being waged against her, and she hadn't even known she'd been drafted into it. She backed away from the curtain step by careful step. Back down the hall past the photos from their wedding in Cape Cod, the ones she used to love, until she realized she wasn't smiling in most of them. She reached the bedroom and shut the door softly. No confrontation, no accusation. Instead, she opened the drawer of her nightstand, pulled out a small black notebook, military-issued, battered edges, pages lined with her precise handwriting. Deployment schedules, medical records, code reminders. She wrote one line, 3:12 a.m. Nate on balcony. She won't see it coming. Paperwork, Wednesday. Then she flipped to a new page and titled it, Phase 0 Observation. The next day, nothing was different on the surface. Nate made his coffee with oat milk and cinnamon like he always did. He kissed her cheek distractedly. He asked if she wanted sushi Friday night. He smiled, the kind of smile you give someone right before pushing them off a cliff. Elena smiled back. She nodded, and then she began to watch. Not in paranoia, in protocol. She noted how he double-locked his phone now. Face ID and thumbprint. She noted the hidden folder app. She noted the way he deleted call logs by noon every day, but not browser history too obvious. She observed his schedule shifts, how he started staying later at the gym. He checked the mailbox obsessively, but left the envelopes unopened. At night, she lay in bed beside him and counted the distance between their shoulders. She didn't sleep much, but she didn't mind. Sleep had never protected her the way vigilance did. On Tuesday night, she went out to the garage while he showered and found his briefcase slightly ajar. Inside a manila envelope with a folded copy of her birth certificate, bank statements from their joint account, and a draft letter addressed to a divorce attorney in Savannah. Subject line: Preliminary Asset Division. No signature, no apology, no acknowledgement of the irony that he would sign her away the day she was born into this world. Elena didn't cry. Instead, she tucked everything back into place, zipped up the case, and turned off the garage light. Wednesday was coming. But she wasn't walking into it blind anymore. She'd spent a decade studying battle readiness evacuation drills and worst-case scenarios. Now she would study Nate. And in the quiet space between betrayal and reaction, she began something he never expected: preparation. By Thursday morning, Elena already knew how to smile without letting it reach her eyes. She stirred the coffee slowly, no sugar, no milk, just black the way she liked it, and watched Nate scroll his phone across the kitchen island. He looked up only once to say, "Hey, I might be late today." Morning call ran long. "Sure," she replied, keeping her tone light. "Everything okay?" He nodded too fast. "Yeah, just some tax prep stuff. Boring. Tax prep." He offered her a quick kiss on the forehead, too quick for her to read anything in it, and disappeared out the door. The front door closed with a satisfying finality, and she stood in the kitchen, hands still curled around her mug. Something about that word tax unlocked a memory. Back in her deployment years, they used to joke that financial irregularities were just military code for someone's hiding something. And this week, Elena had learned that nothing about Nate was random. So she went back to her laptop. She hadn't checked their joint accounts in months. Nate had always handled the bills. She'd let him because trust was her default, because she'd assumed he'd never weaponize silence. She logged in. The first thing she noticed was that the account name had changed. It used to say, Harper Household, Joint 2016. Now it simply said NH Consulting Discretionary. She blinked. Consulting. She dug deeper. Over the last 45 days, there were 5 separate transfers, all under $9,000, to an entity called Doral Management Services. She Googled it. No website. Just a line in a legal registry in Delaware and a disconnected phone number. The amounts were just small enough to avoid standard flags for review. If she hadn't known what to look for, she might have missed it entirely. But she had seen this kind of laundering before back in her days reviewing procurement audits for military contractors overseas. And Nate couldn't spell procurement if you spotted him 3 vowels. Her instincts clicked into place like a loaded chamber. She didn't ask him. She emailed someone else. An hour later, her screen blinked with a new message from Staff Sergeant Marissa Langston, now a senior compliance officer at their regional bank. "Elena, I don't know what's going on and I'm not asking, but I checked the access logs like you said. Your name was removed from the NH Consulting account 3 weeks ago. By Nate, without notifying you. And he authorized a new power of attorney, naming only himself." Elena stared at the screen. 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks before he whispered into the night, "She won't see it coming." She closed the laptop quietly. No dramatics, no panic, just pressure, contained. That evening, Nate returned home with takeout sushi from the place near the bay that she liked. He set it down on the table like a peace offering. "I figured we could do something easy tonight," he said, handing her a pair of chopsticks. "How's your day?" She smiled, studied. "Fine." Halfway through the miso soup, he leaned back and said too casually, "You know, we should really start getting our finances in order." She looked up. Chopsticks paused in midair. Just thinking ahead, he continued. "Like, maybe listing everything we own, clarifying stuff. Joint titles, insurance, that kind of thing." Elena's expression didn't change. Just in case he added, sipping his sake. She set her bowl down. "In case of what?" He laughed as if she were being silly. "I don't know, earthquake, zombie apocalypse," but his eyes didn't match the laugh. They never did anymore. She nodded slowly. "Sure, makes sense. That night, after he fell asleep peacefully, like men who believed they were still in control, Elena returned to her black notebook. She wrote in even lines, Thursday. NH Consulting. Account access revoked. New power of attorney. Marissa confirms the timeline. Nate suggests listing assets. Dinner equals sushi equals distraction. Tax equals pretext. Verify. She opened her browser again and searched divorce attorneys Savannah plus consulting appointments. On the fourth listing down, her breath caught. An attorney named Daniel Kessler had a confirmed consultation scheduled the previous Monday, under Nate's name, labeled Business Evaluation, Marital Asset Planning. Her eyes scanned the confirmation email he'd forwarded to himself, still sitting in the trash folder of their shared email account. Subject Kessler Law, 45-minute pre-review, Monday at 2:15 p.m. She remembered that afternoon. He told her he was seeing a CPA about end-of-year projections. He'd even brought home a branded pen that said Millstone Accounting, and now the mask was starting to slip. Nate didn't just want out. He wanted out clean, profitable, and with her, none the wiser. But she was none the wiser anymore. She didn't throw the laptop. She didn't text Marissa again. She didn't scream into the void. Instead, she poured herself a glass of water, sat at the dining table, and stared at the 2 takeout containers still sitting on the counter. One of them, his, still had food inside. Hers was empty. She'd been consuming everything thinking it was nourishment, only to realize now it was a setup. By the time she got up and switched off the kitchen lights, she'd already memorized the contact info for 3 of the best asset protection attorneys on the Eastern Seaboard. There were things she hadn't let herself remember in a long time. Like the way Nate's hair used to fall into his eyes when he was studying hunched over casebooks and legal pads at that little cafe near Broad Street. She was still in uniform, then still reporting to base, before the sun rose her boots loud against the morning sidewalks of Charleston. They were opposites on paper. She was Navy-disciplined, blunt pragmatic. He was a law student, charming, long-winded, full of hypotheticals and easy ambition. They met on a rainy Thursday, the kind of storm that flooded gutters and peeled the paint off bad intentions. She'd offered him her umbrella. He offered to buy her a coffee. He asked 100 questions about her deployments, her command training, and her rank. Said she was the most fascinating woman he'd ever met. She believed him. She shouldn't have. She still remembered her commissioning ceremony, the day she took her oath dressed in crisp blues, standing taller than she ever had. Her parents had driven in from Beaufort. Her commanding officer gave a speech that made her mother cry. Nate didn't come. Said his internship at the firm ran over. Sent a text. Proud of you. Wish I could have made it. She remembered telling herself it was okay. He made up for it with a dinner reservation and roses. But even that night, he spent more time checking his email than looking at her ribbon bar. He never asked what the colors meant. Over the years, the distance became background noise, a dull hum behind the glass. When she earned her second promotion, he said, "They must be really short-staffed." When her photo ran in the base newsletter, he joked, "Damn, they'll let anyone on the front page these days." He called her deployments, "your little assignments." He called her medals desk candy. He'd say it with a laugh, then change the subject. She learned to let it slide like condensation down a window pane. She thought that was what love required, tolerating someone else's smallness and still trying to see the whole view. But now she understood something she hadn't let herself say aloud. He had never been proud of her. He had only been comfortable when she was smaller than him, easier to dismiss, easier to mold. On Saturday morning, while he was in the shower, she passed the kitchen island and saw his iPad still open. She hadn't meant to look, but a message preview flashed across the screen. Sender G. Hamilton message. Just make sure she doesn't get the beach house. She's too proud to fight. She stared at it, unblinking. The silence inside her was complete, like the dead calm before a hurricane. The beach house. Her mother's house. The only place she ever felt like she could breathe, wild vines climbing the porch, the scent of salt-soaked wood, the attic that still held her childhood sketchbooks. It had been in her family for 3 generations. When her mother died, the property passed jointly to Elena and her aunt. 6 months later, the aunt signed over her share, quietly, privately, out of respect. Elena had gone to the county office and updated the deed in person. She remembered the cold plastic chair, the pen that didn't work, the clerk who'd smiled when handing her the stamped copy. She never told Nate. He thought it was still co-owned. He thought he could sell it, hide it, weaponize it. And now he was texting someone about it, confident enough to say she'd never fight for it. She was too proud to fight. She picked up the iPad, opened the full message thread. There were 7 emails exchanged between Nate and Gregory Hamilton, a divorce attorney based in Bluffton. Phrases like asset positioning, equitability strategy, and emotional soft spots leapt off the screen. He'd told the lawyer, "She'll give in if we play it slow. She hates scenes. She won't want to make it ugly." He didn't understand something crucial. Pride hadn't kept her from fighting. She just hadn't known she was at war. Later that evening, as he poured wine and lit candles, she pretended not to see the folder half hidden on his desk labeled Preliminary Division. He was still wearing the same smile he used to wear when he won arguments by changing definitions mid-sentence. He was still performing love like it was a stage role. She excused herself quietly, locked the bathroom door, sat on the edge of the tub, and opened her black notebook. Saturday. Message on iPad. Greg Hamilton, attorney. Just make sure she doesn't get the beach house. Beach house equals deed transfer confirmed under my name. Nate unaware. She added a small underline beneath that last word. Unaware. She stared at it for a long time. Then she flipped back to an earlier page and began mapping her own divisions, not of assets, but of truths. Things he doesn't know. Things he'll never touch again. Things she will not lose. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She folded the notebook shut and stared at herself in the mirror. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't see a woman who had to shrink to be loved. She saw a woman who remembered exactly who she was before someone else started editing her story. And this time, she would be the one writing the ending. Elena didn't cry. She sat at the edge of the bed for exactly 4 minutes after reading the message about the beach house, then stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and pulled down a navy blue binder with a silver crest embossed on its spine. She hadn't touched it in years. Inside were the remnants of a life most people never saw. Honorable discharge papers, deployment tax exemptions, 2 service commendations, and a financial portfolio she'd quietly managed since she was 24. Nate had never asked about it, and she'd never offered, not out of secrecy, but because it was the only thing that still felt like hers. Now it was more than hers. It was her lifeboat. She spent the next 3 days playing her role perfectly. She packed his lunch, laughed at his jokes. He feigned interest when he mentioned a new espresso machine for the guest suite. She even let him touch her lower back again when passing behind her in the kitchen. But each night when he fell asleep, she worked under the glow of her bedside lamp, pulling records, updating logins, scanning legal documents. There was no panic in her movement, only precision. On Wednesday morning, she slipped out before sunrise and drove to a quiet office suite tucked behind a row of oak trees near the marina. The receptionist offered her chamomile tea. She declined. When Clara Jordan entered the room, she recognized her instantly, a former JAG Corps, now one of the most sought-after military-aligned divorce attorneys on the East Coast. Clara didn't offer pity, just a quiet nod of respect. "You waited?" Clara said, sitting down. "I observed," Elena replied. Clara opened the folder Elena handed her. 30 pages neatly labeled. Account numbers, transaction histories, screenshots, email headers. After 15 minutes of silence, Clara closed the folder. "You're not leaving the marriage," she said evenly. "You're protecting yourself from a sinking ship." Elena didn't blink. "That's the only kind worth abandoning." They spoke for over an hour about tactical filings, property claims, and individual retirement accounts. Clara outlined a plan in her notebook, with the cool detachment of someone who'd helped dozens of women walk out of burning homes with everything that mattered still intact. By noon, Elena had reopened her personal retirement accounts untouched since she merged her finances with Nate's 8 years ago. She'd filed a temporary property hold on their downtown condo to prevent any unauthorized refinancing. She also established something new, a private trust fund under her full legal name, Elena Marie Harper, for asset protection and long-term security. She didn't use her married signature. She used her old one, the one she hadn't written since her commissioning. It felt like oxygen. That afternoon, Elena sat on the porch of the beach house. The wind carried salt through the screens and scattered her thoughts like sand. She stood and walked barefoot into the upstairs bedroom. Her mother's old sewing room now filled with stacked boxes of Nate's summer gear, golf shoes, monogrammed towels, bourbon-tasting kits. She took a deep breath. Then she opened her laptop, pulled up the documents Clara had drafted, and made one final decision. The beach house would not be an asset in a war he intended to win through erosion. She was taking it off the board altogether. 2 days later, the transfer was complete. The Harper Beach Foundation was now the legal owner of 112 Gull Point Lane, a nonprofit organization focused on youth coastal education and veteran teen mentorship. The house would be preserved, protected, and alive with kids who needed it more than he ever did. It was Elena's last gift to the version of herself who used to believe home was something you had to fight for. Sometimes she thought you don't win by holding on. You win by letting go strategically, quietly, with grace sharpened into steel. That night, Nate breezed through the door with a smile. "You'll never believe who I ran into, Paul Reinhardt. You remember Paul?" She nodded, stirring pasta on the stove. "Of course. Anyway, he's talking about buying a coastal property for investment. I told him about Gull Point, said we might be looking to sell soon." Elena didn't flinch. "That's premature," she said calmly, spooning sauce onto the noodles. "The deed has changed." He paused. "What?" She turned, handed him his plate. "I transferred it. It's no longer ours." He stared at her, blinking. "What are you talking about?" She met his gaze. "It's not marital property anymore. It's not personal property either. It's protected. It belongs to someone who'll never use it for leverage." He didn't speak for a long time. Then he forced a laugh. "You're bluffing." "Check the public records," she said quietly. "They update by 4 p.m. He didn't finish his dinner. She did. Later that night, as he paced the hallway pretending to be on a call, she sat in the armchair by the window and wrote in her black notebook, Friday. "Trusts active. The retirement fund reopened. Property is held in place. Gull Point transferred to HBF. Nate was unaware until 6:47 p.m. Response: disbelief, denial, silence." She closed the notebook. Then she opened her calendar and highlighted April 5th, the date Clara had circled in red. It wasn't a court date. It wasn't even a filing deadline. It was her birthday. And now it would mark the day she stopped waiting to be protected because she protected herself. The house was quiet when she got home. Not peaceful, just too quiet. The kind that hides orchestration behind calm. The dining table had been set with gold-rimmed plates and long-stemmed flutes. A single candle flickered next to a cake box she didn't recognize. He was already in the kitchen, still in slacks and a dress shirt sleeves rolled halfway, like he wanted to look effortlessly thoughtful. "Happy birthday, Lainey," Nate said, kissing her on the cheek. Lainey! He hadn't called her that in years, not since before she deployed to Bahrain. She forced a small smile and walked past him, placing her bag in the hallway. The moment she touched her phone, it buzzed. Clara Jordan, final packet enclosed. "Happy rebirth day, Elena." I timed it right. She didn't reply, just held her breath and pressed her screen to sleep. By 7:34, guests had arrived. 2 of Nate's colleagues, one of their old neighbors, and a woman Elena didn't recognize. Tall red lips, the kind of confidence that announces itself like a warning. Elena greeted them all politely, accepted compliments about her grace and how well she carries herself, as if those traits somehow buffered the tension that hummed underneath the table like an unspoken dare. Nate poured the wine, laughed louder than necessary. Told the story again about the time Elena got them out of a speeding ticket by quoting maritime law. She smiled, because that night he'd called her aggressive for doing it. They made small talk, talked about real estate, the state of the Navy. Someone mentioned the beach house. Elena just sipped her drink and glanced at the clock. 8:21 p.m. She reached down beneath the tablecloth and opened her phone under the napkin. The documents were there. Her name is across the header in bold serif. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Elena M. Harper v. Nathaniel C. Harper. Filed March 22nd, 2 weeks ago. Signed, stamped, stored. Waiting for this exact moment. Dessert was served. Vanilla cake with a marzipan compass on top, his idea of a clever nod to her Navy past. The symbolism was almost cruel in its irony. Nate stood, tapped his glass lightly, and raised it toward her. To my wife, he began, voice rich like a courtroom closing statement. To Elena, who is brave, sharp, a little scary, sometimes he chuckled, but above all, mine. May this next chapter bring us clarity, and maybe a few fewer spreadsheets. Laughter followed. She raised her glass. Didn't sip. His gaze lingered for a second too long. Then he reached under the table and pulled out a white envelope folded like a financial memo. For you, he said. It's not diamonds, but I thought you might appreciate something foundational. She accepted it with both hands, paused, slid her finger under the seal, opened it without ceremony. Inside was a thick document. Clean margins, summons, filing information, petition for divorce, initiated by Nathaniel C. Harper. Date, April 5th, her birthday. Reason, irreconcilable differences. The others were still chatting, oblivious. Elena folded the document neatly, placed it back in the envelope, and rested her hands on top. Then she looked up at him and smiled, not with anger, not even bitterness, just calm, measured, whole. I've already signed mine, she said, her voice silk over stone. Nate's smile twitched. What? She tilted her head slightly. 2 weeks ago. You'll find the date stamped in the upper corner, March 22nd, filed through Jordan and Langston. He blinked. Elena continued. You were right, Nate. I don't like scenes, but I do believe in clean exits. He looked down at the envelope in her hands, then back at her. I didn't think you didn't think I'd fight, she said quietly, because you mistook stillness for surrender. She leaned in just enough that only he could hear the next part. But everything you left behind was never yours to keep. He didn't respond, couldn't. The candle between them flickered once, then went still. The rest of the dinner passed in fragmented silence. The others sensed the shift, but didn't ask. They filled the space with polite laughter, louder sips of wine, and the sound of forks scraping dessert plates. Elena sat straight, still smiling. But inside, something had moved. Not just broken, but realigned. When the last guest left, Nate closed the door behind them and turned toward her. You planned this, he said flatly. You waited to embarrass me. She shook her head. I didn't wait to embarrass you. I waited to reclaim myself. That's not the same thing. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Elena picked up her coat, walked to the front door, and paused only once to glance at the compass cake. A circle is made to symbolize guidance and direction. The irony made her chest ache with something between sorrow and relief. Don't worry, she said over her shoulder. I won't fight you for the silverware or the wedding china. Then she stepped into the night, where her name was her own again, and her silence had finally finished speaking. The first call came on a Thursday morning, just after Elena returned from her walk. It was short, measured. Hi, this is Officer Mitchell from the Federal Financial Compliance Office. We've received a corroborating tip related to an offshore consultancy linked to your former joint filings. We're not accusing you of anything, Ms. Harper, just letting you know we may be in touch. Elena sipped her coffee and nodded, even though the officer couldn't see. Of course, she replied. Happy to help however I can. She hung up, opened her drawer, pulled out a folder. Inside, a single sticky note written in Clara's precise looping script. Filed anonymous financial misconduct. March 29th. Let the wind carry it from here. Elena closed the drawer and finished her coffee. Later that afternoon, Nate showed up. No warning, no text. Just the sound of his knock, too hard, too fast, like someone pounding on the edge of control. She didn't open the screen door, just pulled back the curtain. His jaw was tight, hair unkempt, the sleeves of his shirt wrinkled collar crooked. "Elena," he said through the mesh. "Open the door." She didn't. "I know what you did," he snapped. Still, she didn't move. "I'm being audited," he said louder. "The account in Belize. You told them." She stepped out onto the porch, calm as moonlight. "I didn't tell them anything," she said. "But maybe someone else connected the dots." His eyes narrowed. "Clara." "She files things," Elena said coolly. "That's her job." "You want me ruined?" he barked. "Is that it?" "No," she replied, crossing her arms. "I want you accountable." He stepped forward. The screen door creaked under his hand. "You think you can just walk away, make your little foundation moves, and look like the good guy?" Elena raised an eyebrow. "You mean the Harper Beach Foundation?" He stiffened. "It's been around for 6 weeks now. The bylaws are public. My name is on the founding board. So yes, I can walk away, Nate. I just decided to leave with something meaningful." His hands curled into fists. "You're not who I married." She tilted her head. "No," she said. "But I'm exactly who I was before you convinced me to shrink." Oh. He didn't stay long. When he left his car, tires skidded slightly in the gravel. Elena waited until the sound faded, then walked inside. She wasn't angry. Not anymore. It was like watching a tree rot from the inside. Eventually, it just split. By the weekend, it started to spread. A text from Aaron, an old mutual friend. "Hey, just saw your name on the foundation. Didn't know you were still doing work down there. Happy for you." A second message from an old Navy contact. "Some consultancy called HNR Solutions is under a fraud audit. Didn't your ex work for them?" Elena didn't reply. Not yet. She just watched as the dominoes continued falling in neat, quiet lines. It was Sunday night when the final piece clicked into place. A knock at the door. This time it was light, hesitant. She opened it. Ilya stood there, Nate's not-so-secret secret. Her hair pulled into a loose braid, makeup barely applied. She looked younger this way, and strangely, smaller. "I'm not here to fight," she said quickly. Elena didn't speak. Ilya took a breath. "I'm done with him." Still, Elena waited. "He told me you were unstable," Ilya continued, "that you'd left him, that you never understood his work. But now, I see it. He's the unstable one. He's panicking, obsessed with reputation, angry that you're winning quietly." Elena folded her arms. "Why are you telling me this?" Ilya's eyes faltered. "Because I was using him. For connections. For investment access. But he's not worth it anymore. He's baggage. And frankly embarrassing." There was a pause. Elena almost felt pity. Almost. But not enough to forget. She nodded toward the sidewalk. "Then walk away." Ilya hesitated. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm not the one who needs that," Elena replied. "Tell it to yourself." And she closed the door. That night, Elena sat on the back porch, wrapped in a light sweater, a cup of mint tea warming her palms. The house was quiet again, but this time it felt peaceful, not artificial. No threats behind the glass, no wires under the floorboards, just her, and the sound of her own breathing. Nate's world didn't collapse all at once, but it cracked, bit by bit. The audit routine. His friends stopped returning calls. One client pulled out. Another flagged him on LinkedIn. And Ilya. She posted a video about learning to stop mistaking charisma for character. Didn't name him, didn't have to. A week later, a new package arrived at Elena's door. No return address. inside a single legal folder containing the updated divorce filings. He'd signed them, no note, just initials at the bottom and the quiet dignity of surrender. She closed the folder, filed it under closure, then brewed another cup of tea. The box was labeled in her mother's handwriting. Just one word, keep. It had been sitting in the upstairs closet for almost 2 years. Elena hadn't touched it, not after the funeral, not during the move, not even when Nate had suggested they just donate the old stuff, no point in clinging to dust. But this Saturday, with sunlight pooling gently through the kitchen window and the beach breeze carrying the scent of magnolia across the porch, she opened it. The cardboard creaked like it remembered too much. Inside pressed linens, a brooch shaped like a lighthouse, handwritten recipes stained with time, and tucked beneath a folded scarf, her mother's journal, brown leather, weather-worn edges, the elastic band still taut after all these years. Elena sat down on the floor, cross-legged, palms steady, and read. Her mother had been many things, careful, elegant at times, overly polite to the point of erasure. But her words, they were fierce. Don't let them convince you your silence means surrender. Elena closed the book and held it to her chest. That single sentence stayed with her. It followed her into the study, into her quiet hours, into her final draft of the letter she'd been holding on to for months. To the Naval Reserve Command Office. After years of service, it is with gratitude and clarity that I resign my commission from the Reserve Forces. Not out of bitterness, but because I have finished the work I needed to do in uniform. I have served, endured, and adapted. Now I will build differently. Not with defense, but with direction. Elena Harper, Petty Officer First Class. Retu, she printed it, folded it once, and let herself cry not for the ending, but for how long it had taken her to admit it was time. The next day she wore jeans and a plain white t-shirt as she stepped into the youth center for the first time, a former fire station turned nonprofit. The space buzzed with energy, teenagers sketching plans for solar ovens, younger kids tracing coastlines with their fingers on a giant wall map. The director, a soft-spoken woman named Renee, gave her a warm tour. "No one here knows your history," Renee said gently. "But they don't need to. They'll see you show up. That's what they remember." Elena nodded. There was a satisfaction in starting over, not from scratch, but from truth. That evening she checked her inbox. 3 unread messages. 1 spam. 1 from her cousin in Vermont. And 1 from a familiar name she hadn't seen in weeks. Nathaniel Harper, subject: "One last talk." "Elena, I know I've lost every right to ask, but please, one conversation, just to explain." She didn't reply, didn't even hesitate. She moved the message to a folder labeled Closed Chapters. Some things didn't deserve answers, only endings. Clara called the next morning. "Elena," she said, voice unusually buoyant. "You have a fan." Elena laughed softly. "Unless it's my mechanic, I'm not interested," Clara continued. "It's a producer from Modern Threshold. You know, that national podcast on financial advocacy. They're running a season on protecting yourself from high-control partners and long-tail divorce. They want your insight." Elena's breath caught. "They know my name?" she asked, cautious. "No. I gave them a version of your story anonymous. They're intrigued by how you shielded your finances, protected your assets without burning the whole world down. They think it could help people, especially women who don't know where to start." Elena looked out the window. A group of kids at the youth center was planting coastal grasses for erosion control. One of the girls, a quiet 12-year-old who reminded her of herself, waved shyly from across the fence. Elena waved back, then said, "I'll do it, but only if I can stay anonymous." Clara smiled. "I figured you'd say that." The interview was scheduled for the following week. Just her voice, just her words. She recorded from her living room with a soft lamp lit, and her mother's journal on the desk beside her. "I didn't see myself as brave," she told the host. "I just knew that if I didn't make moves in silence, I'd have nothing left when the noise came." The host asked how she knew where to begin. Elena paused. "My mom used to say, No one can take your roots if you learn to plant them deeper than fear. So I didn't start with confrontation. I started with documentation. A will, a trust, a new password, a quiet plan. The host was quiet a moment, then said softly, "You're helping more people than you know." And for the first time, Elena believed it. By the end of the week, the old journal had found a new place on a shelf above her desk, right beside a photograph of the beach house. Not the house itself, but the new sign at its entrance, the Harper Shore Initiative. A home for resilience. A nod to legacy. A rewrite of meaning. That night, a girl from the center handed her a crumpled paper before heading home. It was a sketch, shaky lines, imperfect scale, but it was unmistakable. A lighthouse standing tall on a cliff. Underneath, in messy cursive, "Thank you for showing me I can still shine after the storm." Elena smiled. She folded the drawing, placed it beside the journal, then turned off the light. For the first time in years, she felt wholly seen. Not for what she survived, but for what she chose to build after. The call came just after sunset. Elena was folding laundry, nothing dramatic, just clean lines and warm fabric, the hum of a life, finally at ease. Outside her window, the marshes of Charleston shimmered gold under the falling light, and somewhere in the background, wind chimes tinkled from a neighbor's porch. Her phone buzzed once, then again. Then the screen lit up with a name she hadn't seen in weeks. Nathaniel Harper. She stared at it. No panic, no dread, just a strange stillness, like noticing a storm far out at sea, and knowing finally it can't touch you anymore. She let it ring. Then without thinking too hard, she answered. "Hello?" A pause. "Elena," he said, his voice rough, too smooth to be natural, too brittle to hold. "Didn't think you'd pick up." She didn't reply. He began again, then shifted tones like changing suits. "I wanted to understand. You really think you're better than me now?" Elena blinked, not from surprise, but from how tired the question felt. "No," she said, her voice even. "I don't think I'm better. Just freer. And that terrifies you." There was a silence, the kind you feel more than hear. She imagined him pacing his expensive watch, his furrowed brow, the glass of something in his hand, meant to look casual, but used to anchor nerves. "You think you're noble," he said, "turning your back on a marriage like this?" "I didn't turn my back on anything," she replied. "I just stopped pretending there was still something to turn toward." His breath caught. And then, like always, he tried the oldest trick he had. Guilt. "You used to believe in us," he said. "You wore that ring like it meant something. You said I was your family." "And you were," she said gently. "Until you turned partnership into possession, until you mistook my quiet for weakness." "That's not fair." "No," she cut in. "What's not fair is filing for divorce on my birthday, hiding assets, using a fake consultancy to bleed us dry. What's not fair is rewriting our story to cast me as difficult, just because I stopped applauding your mediocrity." He went quiet. The kind of quiet that's not humility, but offense. "You always had to win, didn't you?" Elena took a slow breath. She looked down at the soft cotton shirt in her lap, the edges folded into neat thirds, her life newly reassembled. "No," she said, "I never had to win. I just needed peace. You had my loyalty. You used it. You lost it." He scoffed. A half laugh sharp like broken glass. "You think this makes you righteous?" She closed her eyes. This man, the years, the lies, the performance, all of it felt small now, like a costume that no longer fit, a language she no longer spoke. "I don't need to be righteous, Nate," she said calmly. "I just need to be done." He was still talking when she hit end call. She didn't listen to the rest, didn't give him another second of stage time in a story he no longer owned. She opened her contacts, scrolled down, tapped block caller, confirmed. No dramatic sigh, no emotional swell, just silence. The good kind. The next morning, she left her phone in the drawer. She brewed coffee slowly, wore her softest sweater, read through scholarship applications for the youth program. One girl wanted to be a marine biologist. Another had drawn a map of every coastal town she hoped to visit one day. No sadness in the ink, just ambition. Later, she walked to the post office and dropped off the last set of tax forms, one envelope addressed to her lawyer, another to her accountant. The final pieces of shared accounts formally split. No trace of Nate, no shared returns, no signature but her own. At the counter, the clerk smiled. "Anything fragile?" She shook her head. "No, it's already been handled." Died. That night, she sat by the water behind her home and watched the tide come in. There were no words left to say, no battles to wage, just the quiet power of release. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, the resignation letter from the reserves. She hadn't burned it or buried it, just carried it once in a while to remind herself, you don't need to fight to prove your strength. Sometimes leaving is the bravest thing you can do. A soft wind moved through the marsh. She let it carry the rest, and then she walked back inside. Light on, door closed, life intact. She was done surviving him, and just beginning to live herself. The room was quiet, but not in the way empty spaces are. It was the kind of quiet that happens right before someone says something they've waited a lifetime to say, and the kind of silence where everyone knows they should listen. Elena Harper stood behind the podium, her hands gently folded, a navy blazer pressed sharp across her shoulders. She didn't wear medals. No photos of Nate, no loud slogans, just a single slide behind her that read, "Financial independence for the ones who hold it all together." It had been 1 year, 12 months since she blocked his number, since she walked away without fire, without spectacle, since she chose a different kind of survival, the quiet kind, where you wake up each day and build a life from the inside out. Now she ran a nonprofit. Anchor and Rise was a financial education initiative for military spouses, especially those who had spent years holding down household schedules, deployments, and dreams deferred. She taught them how to read financial statements, protect joint accounts, recognize economic abuse, and draft escape plans, not from panic, but from purpose. She'd partnered with base programs across the Southeast, delivered workshops on everything from credit literacy to divorce law, spoke at women's shelters, wrote grants, stayed up late with spreadsheets and receipts and scar tissue. But she never once said his name. Not in interviews, not in meetings, not even in casual conversations over lunch with other advocates. Bitterness, she had learned, was a chain disguised as armor. She didn't need it. She had something better now, clarity. Her voice was calm as she reached the final line of her keynote address. "I used to think strength looked like staying, like holding out until the storm passed. But storms don't always pass, and sometimes the house you're protecting isn't even yours." She paused, letting the words settle. "So let me offer this to anyone sitting here tonight wondering if you're being too dramatic, too emotional, too hard to love. You don't have to win the war to leave it. Sometimes walking away is the bravest act of all." For a moment, no one moved. Then someone clapped. And then the room followed wave after wave of applause, not thunderous, but deeply human, like breath returning to lungs that had been holding too much for too long. She didn't bow. She didn't wave. She just smiled, collected her notes, and walked off the stage. As she reached the side corridor, someone touched her wrist. A woman, maybe mid-40s, a service member's spouse by the look of her base-issued lanyard and the tight way she held her breath. She pressed a folded note into Elena's palm. "You gave me the courage to walk too," she whispered, then disappeared into the crowd. Elena stood still for a moment, let the hallway grow quiet again, then unfolded the paper. It was handwritten, rushed but clear. "He never hit me, but he erased me. Your story made me feel like I wasn't crazy. Tomorrow morning I meet with the housing advocate. I'm not going back." Elena folded it carefully and tucked it into her notebook between pages of stats and lecture notes and timelines. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. She just nodded. Another bridge not burned, but walked away from. Later that night, she sat on the porch of her new home, modest sunlit, tucked behind live oaks just outside Charleston. It wasn't the beach house, but it was hers. Fully, legally, emotionally. The nonprofit's first interns had started that month. All of them were women who had once sat in back rows ashamed to raise their hands. Now they asked questions with boldness, sent spreadsheets like declarations. Inside her home office, beside the framed nonprofit charter, was a single photograph, her mother smiling faintly on the porch steps of the old house, a worn leather-bound journal in her lap. Next to it, a sticky note in Elena's own handwriting. Don't let them convince you your silence means surrender. The next morning, she brewed coffee without rush, checked her inbox, read 3 donor thank you notes, replied to 1, ignored the unread message labeled "From Unknown." She didn't need to open it. She didn't need to prove anything anymore. The weight she used to carry in her chest had shifted. It had become foundation, not revenge, not victory, reclamation. She hadn't burned the bridge. She'd just stopped waiting for a seat at a table that never saw her clearly and built her own damn road. Now she walked it in her own rhythm, spoke in her own voice, and in doing so, made space for others to find theirs too. Endnote. Her name would never be trending, her face wouldn't be on a magazine, but around the country, women were printing her worksheets, highlighting her advice, sharing her story, not for drama, for direction. And maybe that was the quietest form of power, when the ones they tried to silence became the reason others spoke up. Elena Harper lived simply, truthfully, freely. And that was enough, more than enough, always had been.